Welcome to the Backs to the Wall podcast. Four mates talking all things football with some special guests and other sporting shenanigans thrown in as well. This week on the wall, we'll be giving you our worst ever Premier League 11. After that, it's our sent into the reserves feature. This week on the show, it's the listeners at home who will be providing their nominations. We'll also have the return of the Lockdown Accumulator. This week we'll be betting on the Premier League as it returns, the Championship, the Bundesliga and the La Liga. So before we get into our worst ever Premier League 11, anything interesting happening in the footballing world this week?
So for all you wanting to hear about Sunderland news, last week League One finally voted to end the season, meaning that points per game were going to decide the season, meaning Sunderland would stay in the league for another season, which of course I'm delighted about. But we also have seen our first league champions from games that have restarted. Bayern Munich today have won the Bundesliga after beating Werder Bremen.
Well, the latest news in Scotland is that Hearts and Partick Thistle will be taking legal action against the SPFL in their ending of the season and confirming relegation for Hearts from the Scottish Premier League and Partick Thistle from the Championship. Partick Thistle have performed a spectacular U-turn on this, as they said just yesterday that they would love to pursue legal action, but it wouldn't be something that would be sort of cost effective. Much rather put their funds towards getting out of League One at the first time of trying. But a generous unknown benefactor has supposed that he or she will be able to fund Partick Thistle's legal campaign with Hearts at no cost to Thistles. In France and Belgium, courts deemed that it wasn't fair for relegation to take place. So, as I say, it'll be interesting. Keep your eye on Scottish football over the up and coming weeks.
Yeah, interesting news from Scotland. Also interesting news today. Marcus Rashford, after his campaign surrounding the free school lunches over in England, he was talking about the sacrifices his mother had to make whenever he was in school. So it's good to see footballers doing something really worthwhile. So last week we gave you our best ever Premier League 11, and this week we're going to give you our worst ever Premier League opinion, of course, only in our opinion. And the slight caveat with this is they have to have played at least 50 games in England. We'll go through some of our suggestions, and hopefully it will be a pretty awful team at the end. So we'll start with our goalkeeper then. Who have you gone for?
I think the goalkeeper for me was probably one of the most challenging ones, as you kind of thinking if the goalkeeper's played 50 games in the Premier League, he must be pretty decent. I narrowed it down to Manuel Almunia, the former Arsenal goalkeeper, as I just kind of remember him as being quite a dodgy keeper, one that had a few mistakes in him. I think a lot of people were surprised when he became number one after Jens Lehmann left, and he did, to be fair, manage over 100 appearances for Arsenal, so it's probably a bit harsh, but I just didn't think he was that good of a keeper.
I think I'm sort of in the same boat as Andrew here, that the goalkeeper was a particularly difficult one to narrow down. But I've decided to go for the Brazilian shot stopper, Hilario Gomes, just simply because his time at Tottenham, I just remember watching clip after clip of his mistakes. I mean, from shots just slipping underneath him and through his hands to him fumbling shots into the net. Gomes just seemed like a complete and utter bomb scare almost every week, and you were never comfortable watching Match of the Day when he was in nets. But I suppose one of his saving graces that he did end up going to Watford, and he had a much better spell there than at Tottenham. So I don't know if that is something to consider. I know that he was obviously a pretty hellish keeper at Tottenham, but he may be saved from the 11. But I don't know what you boys think.
I've gone for the Finnish goalkeeper, Peter Enkelman. He was the first kind of goalkeeper that came to mind. You'll probably all have seen that really, really awful mistake he made from a throw-in. I think it's the right back takes a throw-in towards the keeper, and he scuffs it over his boot and it goes into the net. That also happened to be in the derby. It was Aston Villa against Birmingham, and they went on to lose 2-0. So yeah, Peter Enkelman for me. Like you said, it's kind of hard with the goalkeepers because he's 52 appearances for Aston Villa, so you think he probably can't be that bad, but that was one of the worst goalkeeping howlers that I think you'll ever see.
I think just judging by, I just remember how bad that moment was and how infamous it's become. I would be willing to side with Enkelman.
Yeah, I think I'm in the same position. I mean, I don't really remember much about him, but I do remember that mistake, and it was just horrific.
Interesting enough, Peter Enkelman now he now works delivering parcels. It's not that there's anything wrong with that, but he works for DHL Express, so
A pair of safe hands at your door, or not so safe.
Right back was kind of a tricky one for me, but I'm going to stick with the Arsenal trend here and go for Emmanuel Aboué, who game managed over 100 appearances for Arsenal, but he's one that I just kind of remember as a pretty average fullback. And when you kind of add on his baffling move to Sunderland, where he managed 0 appearances and got banned by FIFA for failing to pay an agent. But it wasn't only that. I mean, Aboué was kind of largely used as a squad player by Wenger. And a major thing that stands out for me was when he was subbed off against Wigan in 2008, despite coming on as a sub. And he actually went off the field crying and stated that the fans booing made him cry and made him not want to return to training. So I think he has to go into my team for that.
I think you've got a pretty strong case when someone's brought to tears. I've gone for perhaps a slightly unusual one, Rigobert Song, and I know that he could play centre-back as well as right back, but he makes it into my side as when you look at his career overall, and he had so many appearances for Cameroon and was very, very impressive. He'll be a stalwart in their Hall of Fame, but when he came to the Premier League with Liverpool, he was really unimpressive, and those traits of physicality at centre half and right back really weren't apparent. And he also missing for 3 months of the season when he was away at the African Cup of Nations, so that didn't go down too well with Liverpool fans. But when he came back, he actually never played again for them, and he then went to West Ham and again had a pretty unsuccessful career there. He had a pretty hellish debut against Sheffield Wednesday, and I remember the commentators ripping into him during that game. His last game for them came in a 5-0 thumping from Everton. All round, I think his footballing career in England was just very, very uneventful, and he's remembered for all the wrong reasons. So that's why Rigobert Song gets nominated for my right back.
Yeah, I've found the fullbacks quite difficult. I've ended up going for Fabio, as in Fabio da Silva. Maybe it's unfair because I think he was probably more naturally a left back, but had to play right back a lot for United. I was never terribly confident whenever he was on the pitch anyway. He seemed to spend most of his time playing everywhere else except right back. And yeah, I just remember him. I feel that Raphael was much better. Maybe slightly harsh, but he was the first one that came to mind.
I think for this one, I'm going to have to side with Andrew, because Aboué leaving the pitch in tears after receiving copious amounts of boos from the fans, just that's doesn't sit right with me. So I think I'm going to have to go with him.
Yeah, I didn't actually know that about Aboué, but yeah, I think he gets my vote as well. That's rather poor.
But I suppose in Aboué's defence, if I had many thousands of people booing at me whenever I got a touch of the ball, it would probably bring me to tears as well, and so I can feel his pain.
Centre halves then.
So before I actually make my pick, I'm going to defend someone who I can only assume is going to get nominated by both Michael and Jamie. One of my great idols growing up, Titus Bramble. For some reason, when he joined Sunderland, I just grew quite an affection to him and kind of idolised him. It was kind of weird because I knew he was poor, but I just really liked him. And he's appeared in all these articles being one of the worst players ever. And I just want to say that I've got nothing to do with this.
Well, I think I'll jump in first then, and my first centre back on the list is Titus Bramble. Now, I remember I was talking about Match of the Day before, but when I used to watch it with my dad and my brother, when I was watching teams they played for like Sunderland and Newcastle, he was just horrendous at the back. It was just mistake after mistake, and it was sort of like head in your hands watching him play. And there's like a over 3 minute long highlight reel on YouTube, and the song "Have a Bad Day" is playing over it. And honestly, your mouth will be hanging open if you look that up on YouTube after, because Titus Bramble's highlight reel is horrendous. So for me, he's a nailed on candidate for centre back in our worst ever Premier League 11.
I've also picked Titus Bramble as one of my selections. Jamie was mentioning some of the YouTube videos. There's a good one. It's called "How is Titus Bramble Paid to Play Football?" And it's kind of a highlight reel of back in, I think it was 2008, the video's from, but he didn't really seem to be able to concentrate whenever he was on the pitch, and like Jamie says, you would just be watching him with your mouth open. Yeah, one of those players that really should never have been a centre back.
I'll admit he was one of those players that hoofed the ball when there was no sign of danger. I have actually been on a night out with a T-shirt with me and Titus Bramble on.
So that's good in itself, but it's no defence. On some of his highlights reels that I was watching earlier on, he scores a bullet header own goal. And he goes to clear a cross that's put in against Arsenal, and he just completely misses the ball, and Henry scores. He's got to be on the list.
They compared him. They said he was going to be a partner for Rio Ferdinand. It's safe to say he
should have been.
He didn't achieve that potential. But yeah, it was a mix of own goals and red cards and God. I mean, how long was he at Sunderland for?
I think he was 2 or 3 years. I remember he didn't play a single game when Di Canio came because he deemed he was overweight. I think we'll move on before I start crying. So my two centre halves are Eliaquim Mangala, who signed for Man City for, it was around over 30 million, but it was reported it was about 40 million as well. So he's by far the most expensive player on my team here. And he just wasn't suited to the Premier League at all. Like, he couldn't deal with the power or the pace, and he just looked so out of his depth for such a big transfer fee. Like, he just didn't look like he suited that at all. And there was no surprise that he left on a free transfer like a few years later. My second centre half actually comes with one of the most bizarre and probably unwanted stats you could have. He has the joint most Premier League relegations at 5. He's been relegated for every Premier League team he's played for, and that is Herman Hreidarsson, who has actually got over 300 Premier League games, but when you hold 5 relegations to your name, you've got to be doing something wrong.
I'm going to struggle to nominate anyone here that's going to get in front of him, because that's a horrendous stat to boast. But my other candidate was Paul McShane, the Irishman, and I just remember Paul McShane just, in my opinion, being an all-round pretty poor defender in the Premier League, just being very slow, just with the ball at his feet, just very uncomfortable looking and hard to watch at times. Remember just players going round him with ease because of his pace, and remember a couple of horrendous passes as well. So Paul McShane's my nomination as my other centre half.
Like Jamie, I've gone for Titus Bramble, and my second centre half is Anton Ferdinand, who of course never reached the heights of his brother. I remember being particularly poor, and I can remember listening to, I think it was QPR fans on 5 Live or something. I mean, they could not stand Anton Ferdinand. I can remember like them coming on and saying it must have been one big game in particular that he'd been really poor in, and they just were getting so sick of it every week. Like, he was just useless, and he was literally causing goals week in, week out. So I think that would be a pretty poor centre-back pairing, Titus Bramble and Anton Ferdinand.
It's the stuff that would keep you awake at night.
It sounds like we're naming our worst ever Sunderland 11 here. Both players used to play for us. Christ, last week we wouldn't have got anywhere near the best team, but we could fill a whole 11 with the worst team by the looks of it.
So our two centre-backs then, Titus Bramble and Hreidarsson. So who have you gone for then, Andrew, over at left-back?
Left-back's probably the one I've got the weakest case for, as I've gone for former Liverpool and Aston Villa left-back Ali Sissoko. I think he was only in the Premier League for about 4 seasons or so, but I just remember him being poor and quite easily to beat. In that season he was at Liverpool, it was that year under Brendan Rodgers where they nearly won the title, and he lost his place early on to John Flanagan, who is actually a right-back. And there's no surprise to me that Sissoko joined Villa, and he's now got a relegation to his name, as I think he was one of their poorer players that year that they got relegated.
No, my nomination was actually a player who I'd completely forgotten about, and it wasn't until I started doing some research when his name popped up that I remembered more about him. And my nomination is Wayne Quinn. And although he did play quite well for Sheffield United, his stint at West Ham in the Premier League, which gets my nomination, and he just had an overall horrendous campaign for them, and he's featured on a couple of West Ham forums that I came across as being their worst ever signing. Now, West Ham, who have suffered a few relegations over the years, and to say that he's the worst player that they've had in their history speaks volumes. And to back it up further, Wayne Quinn retired at 28, so I think he's got a pretty strong case as being the worst left-back Premier League has ever seen.
So I've gone for an Arsenal defender, Pascal Sagan. Now, granted, he did play at centre back, but he could play. Well, he claimed he could play at left back as well. He was part of Arsenal's undefeated invincible squad of 03-04. But I'd say out of all the players that were in that team, he must be one of the least memorable. Whenever they're chanting at the ground, he's bald, he's shit, he plays when no one's fit. And that's your own fans singing that. There's something seriously wrong. But yeah, he was really slow, wasn't the best tackler. I think he managed to play 60 odd games for Arsenal in the end. But yeah, he wasn't great.
I think Sagan was one of these names that kept on popping up when you're looking at the worst players to ever play in the Premier League. But I think the thing for me that gets my vote is that wonderful song about him being shit and playing when no one's fit.
Yeah, when you've got a song like that made up about you, and it's your own fans singing it, and they're the ones that see you week in, week out, or with Sagan, it wouldn't quite have been that often, but he definitely gets my vote.
So Pascal Sagan then, out left. Move on to the midfield. 2 centre mids.
I've actually gone for 2 former Premier League winners for the centre midfield for me. Firstly, I have the Brazilian Anderson, who kind of seemed to regress as a player each season at Man United, having been signed for 27 million. And he managed over 100 appearances, picking up 4 Premier League titles and a Champions League, which is impressive stats for someone I'm claiming as one of the worst centre mids to grace the Premier League. But anyway, I think it's mainly a case of a player who's fallen victim to the early hype of his career. He was deemed this wonder kid, and he's kind of went from a wonder kid when he first joined Man United to like a laughing stock towards the end. I mean, I know his career at Man United was hampered with loads of injuries, but I just seem to remember in the latter stages pictures of him being overweight and just really barely playing. There was no surprise again that he left on a free transfer. So my second central midfielder is former Man United, Everton and Sunderland midfielder Darren Gibson. Generally speaking, when I'm talking about Sunderland players and being poor, I feel quite bad, but Darren Gibson is a player I have no regrets about putting into this team. Even mentioning his name actually gets me angry. Gibson does actually have a Premier League title to his name, but his career's largely been affected with injuries, kind of like Anderson. For me, there's no surprise that he found himself in League Two playing for Salford this season, as he wasn't quick enough or kind of good enough for me. He was, of course, signed by David Moyes for Sunderland, where he has a relegation to his name, and a year after signing for us, he would be sacked for a second drinking-related incident. The first was, of course, when he was telling the fans that his teammates were all shit, which he was probably right. But anyway, the second was the day after St Patrick's Day, where he crashed into a load of parked cars, being over the drink drive limit on his way to training in the morning. So for me, he has to get in that team.
Yeah, I've also nominated Darren Gibson. He's had quite the fall from grace in terms of being signed at Man United. Fergie said he was going to be Roy Keane's kind of replacement as he started to age, and I mean he's just been released from Salford City in League Two. So yeah, I did actually see Gibson play for Sunderland. I went to one of the matches, and I just remember how he was as slow as a bus, which is not what you want from somebody playing in the middle of the park. So
that probably wasn't the standout of that game there.
Sunderland Millwall, and I witnessed what honestly was it 3 of the most unbelievable, 3 or 4 of the most
four
of the most unbelievable goalkeeping errors that I've ever seen in my life. But yeah, Darren Gibson, and also I was going to mention as well his pretty poor record behind the wheel and those drunken rants about we're all shit, we're all fucking shit about Sunderland. Yeah, for my other player, I've gone for the Manchester United flop, Eric Djemba-Djemba. Played 39 times for Manchester United and did walk away with an FA Cup winners medal and a Community Shield, playing under Sir Alex. After 39 games, we ended up at Aston Villa, and he only played 6 times.
So like Michael, I've decided to go for Eric Djemba-Djemba as well. There was the line that he was so good they named him twice, but that might fit better with JJ Okocha. So I just remember him when he was at Man United just being absolutely hopeless, and I think he'd been brought in and he was kind of compared to Roy Keane. His tackling ability when he entered the Premier League was just shocking, and he wasn't up to it at all. It was soon after joining Man United he was sort of found out and he was shipped out to Aston Villa, where he really struggled to maintain a first team place. And I remember a few years back, must be about 2014-15, he suddenly surfaced at St Mirren in Scotland. He wasn't even good enough to play in the Scottish Premier League. It wasn't only that, he was taking home about £75,000 a month when he was at Manchester United, and it became apparent in recent years that he was actually paying all 75k of that to various bills and debts that he had. He just went mad with the money. And it was only sort of appearance fees, etc., which he was living off, and he was declared bankrupt when he was at Aston Villa. I think that he's a very strong candidate to be in our worst 11. So my other nomination for the central midfield spot is actually Joey Barton. And although that may sound a tad surprising to some of you, it's mainly not just through his footballing ability, but as that was generally pretty good, and he was an all right central midfielder, but his antics on and off the pitch for me, that's why he gets into my team today. The fact that he had 269 appearances in the Premier League, and he had 257 fouls, 78 yellow cards and 6 red cards, just shows how much of a hothead he was, and his disciplinary record speaks for itself. That amazing game between QPR and Man City back in the 11-12 season epitomises everything about Joey Barton, when he elbows Carlos Tevez in the face and he's completely surprised and argues with the ref when he gets sent off. Not only that, but he goes up to Aguero and knees him as hard as he can to Aguero's left leg. Aguero goes down. Vincent Kompany runs up to challenge Joey Barton, and Joey Barton headbutts him. So for me, Joey Barton has to be in there. Also, I'd like to mention, he thought he would come up to Scotland and prove to be the best player in the league. He often sort of down-talked the quality up in Scotland, but he only made a handful of appearances for Rangers, and he was absolutely horrific. He was a starting centre midfielder in a 5-1 drubbing by Celtic, and left Scotland with his tail between his legs. So, yeah, he gets my nomination for my central midfield spot.
I think with 2 votes each, Eric Djemba-Djemba and Darren Gibson have to go into our central midfield.
Who have you gone for then out in the right?
So I think when it came to wide players, it was kind of hard to pick, but for me, I've gone for Matt Phillips, and this is one that I'm sure Scott will be very happy of, as finally his years of ranting about Matt Phillips being a poor player has rubbed off on me, and he's making my worst ever Premier League team. We heard from Scott in his reserves nomination about how much he disliked Matt Phillips. To be fair, the stats kind of back him up in the Premier League. He played 109 games with only 5 goals, and he's been involved in 3 relegations with 3 different teams.
Yeah, I think it's quite fitting that you put Matt Phillips in that position, but my one goes to Anderson of Manchester United, and I know that you mentioned him before, Andrew, for your centre midfielder, but I decided that I'd seen him play a few times out right mid, and saw on some of the statistics that he could play there. And when he arrived at Man United for 20 million, he had really high hopes. He had quick feet, speed, strength, all that. But he was part of a really good Manchester United team, so it was hard for him to get in. You had the likes of Scholes and Fletcher, etc. in the middle, and Cristiano Ronaldo in the early stages out on the right. But as Andrew was saying before, he never managed to sort of stamp his place on the team. After he left Manchester United, I noticed an interesting bit of information that he went back home to Internacional back in Brazil, and he was subbed off in the 30th minute of one of their games, and he required oxygen at the side of the pitch. Now, I think they say that it was bad altitude, but other reports say that it was really just down to poor fitness. So Anderson goes into my right midfield slot.
He's won a Champions League. Well, out on the right, my nomination is a player who never really escaped the spotlight, but for all the wrong reasons, and he won't be remembered for really any of the goals or any trophies or anything like that. He'll be remembered for all of his antics, and specifically his rather shameless spitting. So I'd like to nominate El Hadj Diouf. His stats are also pretty awful. Played obviously quite a few games at Liverpool. He was at Bolton. He was at Sunderland as well. And made the loan move up to Rangers at one point as well. But he didn't score very many goals, and yeah, he's just not really a very, very likeable player, is he? So El Hadj Diouf for me.
Well, I think given that Anderson does have a fair few Premier League medals and also a Champions League win under his belt, I'll have to side with Andrew and go for Matt Phillips over in the right midfield.
Yeah, fair enough. Matt Phillips it is then. Will be our right midfielder. Over on the left, who have you gone for?
In at left midfield for me is former Man United and Newcastle winger Gabriel Obertan. Now, knowing many Newcastle fans, I constantly heard how much of a poor player he was. He was kind of your typical head down and run type of player whose only main asset was pace. He, like many of the players on my team, is one to have suffered a relegation. But strangely enough, he does have a Premier League medal to his name when he was bought by Alex Ferguson at Man United. Obertan's kind of had a stigma of being a massive flop in the Premier League. I mean, he's played 72 games and scored 2 goals. So for me, he has to make the team.
So out on the left, I've actually decided to go again for perhaps a controversial one of Kieran Richardson. And now, I'm partly doing this because I remember when I was young and growing up, Kieran Richardson's name was always brought up as a sort of a bright hope for English football and a really good young talent. And he was decent, I think, in his early appearances for Manchester United, but he really never hit the heights. And he's one of these other players that seems to have been cursed just because he was branded by so many as being the next big thing. But when it should have been sort of the best years of his career in sort of 2013, he was playing for Fulham, and as a sort of wide creative player, he only managed about 3 assists in 43 appearances for them. And then after leaving Fulham, he went to Aston Villa and just sort of staved off relegation in the 14-15 season. But then the next season was the one that Aston Villa were for the first time relegated from the Premier League, and he was booed when he was on the ball and everything when he was there. So he really sort of went off the boil and did not hit the heights that he really could have and maybe should have with his career. But it is really hard when you're given all that praise and touted to be the next best thing at that age. It's really hard to fall between the cracks.
Well, I think that's actually more offensive than Titus Brown will get nominated.
I've also gone for Gabriel Obertan. Yeah, he was one of the kind of weirder signings by Sir Alex Ferguson. Came from a club who I have a bit of a soft spot for, Bordeaux. I have a couple of their strips. But he ended up playing 14 times for Man United, and as Andrew said, it kind of became quite clear earlier on, and even whenever he signed for Newcastle, that he was really he had no end product and was just quite fast. So yeah, he's had a pretty miserable career since then. I think he plays in Turkey now. So yeah, Gabriel Obertan for me. And that completes the midfield then. 2 votes for Obertan. Up front, who have we gone for?
Firstly, I've gone for Jersey Altidore. Now, we've already heard of Jersey's poor career in the Premier League. He, of course, has the honour of being the first player to be sent to our reserves. 70 games in the Premier League with a return of just 2 goals is just abysmal for a striker, especially one that I think we paid about 7 million for, something like that. And I'll say it like I did when I made my nomination for the reserves. When you've got a chant like when Jersey scores, we're on the pitch, shows how much little faith the fans must have in their striker to score. I mean, reluctantly, Jersey's going to have to get there, as I did quite like him, but his record's just so poor. And secondly, I've got Francis Jeffers, another player that's kind of been listed on all these articles about the worst players in the Premier League. Francis Jeffers has 25 goals in 119 games in the Premier League, but 18 of those came in the first 49 games of his career. He's in the illustrious club of people who have 1 cap for England and 1 goal, but his career and reputation really began to go downhill after his £8 million move to Arsenal. He was labelled the fox in the box, but was just one of those players who couldn't live up to expectation. Historically, his transfer to Arsenal is deemed one of the worst in Premier League history, and definitely the worst made by Arsene Wenger. He does have a Premier League title, but I think for his poor record after the first 50 games of his career.
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting statistic to have such a great goal scoring record in the sort of the first half of your games that you play, and then to fall by the wayside so badly. I've actually gone down a different route. I've gone for Marouane Chamakh, the ex-Arsenal, West Ham and Crystal Palace striker. And Michael earlier on mentioned Bordeaux, and that's where Chamakh scored some of his early goals in his career and where he was noticed by Arsene Wenger. But when he arrived at the Emirates, it wasn't all he'd imagined it to be, and he really had a poor career at Arsenal. And I've got some stats here which I just thought were absolutely horrific for a striker. And in his 2011-12 season, he only managed like 0.7 shots per game on average, which is terrible for a striker, especially of a club who are supposed to be historically a top 4 club, who should be battering defences with shots all game. But he definitely didn't achieve that. He did get his break when Van Persie was injured, but he never took it. And when Van Persie regained fitness, Van Persie replaced Chamakh on about the 66th minute in a game and came on to score twice, sort of showing the difference between world class and a player who sort of barely gets pass marks in the Premier League. In total for Arsenal, he scored 8 goals and 40, which is again just a poor return for a club that are supposed to be fighting for the top 4 places in the league. He had a short loan spell at West Ham and a slightly longer spell at Crystal Palace, which never really amounted to much. And in the 103 Premier League appearances for Chamakh, he only scored 15 goals, which is truly shocking for a player who had a little bit of hype behind him when he came.
Yeah, so I've also gone for Marouane Chamakh as one of my picks for all the reasons that Jamie said. I mean, he was supposed to be that big kind of target man, handful for defences with his aerial prowess, but I mean, goodness me, I never saw it, especially whenever he came to Arsenal. As Jamie said, he had a bit of form in France, scored a few goals for Bordeaux around 2008, but yeah, the numbers don't lie, and it's Chamakh for me. And speaking of the numbers don't lie, I have also gone for Jose Altidore. This is kind of an unfortunate one because when you look at him since when he played at Sunderland, he's been absolutely smashing the goals in the MLS for Toronto FC. He's 56 goals in 112 games, so a goal every other game at the minute. However, when he was at Sunderland, he scored 1 goal in 42 matches. So, it's not really good enough, is it? Yeah, numbers don't look good for Altidore. And I'm putting him beside another poor forward in Marouane Chamakh.
My final nomination on our worst ever 11 is David Ngog up front. Another young striker who came to England and the hopes were pretty high for him, and another big striker who was supposed to be a handful for defences. But when he arrived at PSG, he perhaps got off to a slightly good start with Liverpool. He managed to score a couple of goals, but certainly fell by the wayside after a season there. Benitez was quite public in saying that 1.5 million that he paid from PSG was a steal, but in the end it really proved to be 1.5 million too much, in my opinion. He had 63 games for Liverpool and only scored 9 goals, which again for a club who are supposed to be banging in the goals week in, week out, it really isn't a record to boast. Quite amazingly though, they made a decent profit off of him. Bolton seemed to see a bit of a promise in him and signed him for 4 million, but again he never hit the heights there. And I remember him missing an open goal for Liverpool against the club Bolton I was just mentioning there. And Ngog seemed to try his hand up in Scotland after it didn't work out down in England. He managed 10 appearances for Ross County up in the north of Scotland, but he only managed 1 goal, so his career seemed to really, really slip away. And it's another player who the hype might have just got to him, because he's only, I think, 31 now and finds himself playing in the Lithuanian Premier Division. And I don't mean to be disrespectful to the Lithuanian football, but it's certainly not as prestigious as English Premier League, and he definitely gets the spot in my worst Premier League 11.
So lastly then, what about our manager? Who have you guys both gone for?
Like last week, the manager spot for me could only be one person. The man who was deemed the chosen one. I'm going for Mr. David Moyes. When I said Gibson's name gets me angry, it's got nothing on what David Moyes does to me. Let's not get too personal on this. Firstly, I'm going to look at what he's done managing. He's only got 1 title to his name, and that's the Community Shield at Man United. Yes, he did okay at Everton, but he still didn't win anything. For a man in charge for over 10 years, you'd kind of hope he'd have something to back it up. Then you've got his tenure at Man United, which is probably the most famous managerial disappointment in Premier League history. Signing a 6-year contract, Moyes was sacked after less than a season from a club who don't supposedly sack managers. will skip his disastrous time in Spain and jump to his appointment at Sunderland. So after losing Sam Allardyce, we appointed David Moyes, and he took us from seeing the best football and atmosphere I'd probably seen at Sunderland to ripping the soul out of the club. After the second game, Moyes admitted we were in a relegation battle and said we would struggle to stay up. In order to help us stay up, he brought in the old boys who had Stephen Pienaar, Julian Lescott, Victor Anichebe and Brian Oviedo, all to try and help save Sunderland. 10 years ago, that might have been good, but most of them were horrific for us. His spell in Sunderland was just a disaster. We finished bottom that year, and he actually agreed to John Terry getting that ridiculous guard of honour on the 26th minute because our season wasn't pitiful enough. However, he did do the honourable thing and resign after the end of the season. However, he's found himself hired twice now by West Ham, which just blows my mind that he can get another club. And I really hope this season makes it second relegation, as it's what he deserves.
See, having known Andrew, since these events unfolded, you get it almost every day. Him talking about David Moyes and how poor he was, and bringing the old Everton players to Sunderland and how it wasn't the answer. But I think I'm going to have to side with him here, and I sort of feel his pain a bit now. This team find themselves in League One, and it all stems from the poor management of the side in the Premier League. When they got relegated, it just never stopped, and they sort of found themselves in League One now. And I think David Moyes can be sort of held partly accountable for their demise, if not fully. So David Moyes gets my vote.
Yeah, I'm not even going to try and put forward a case to match that one. That was pretty compelling. I will side with Andrew there with David Moyes. You have to say he's right. Should have at least won something at Everton. You'd think, it's not really good enough to be there for 10 years. And yeah, a few very questionable signings when he was in charge at Sunderland.
He did steer West Ham to safety though, Andrew.
I'm not going to dignify that with an answer. Come back at the end of the season and we'll see what happens. I've got a treble on Norwich, Villa and West Ham to go down, and I hope it comes in.
So if we run you through our worst ever Premier League 11, starting with goalkeeper Peter Enkelman. Right back, Bowie. Centre backs were Titus Bramble and Hariderson. We go for the left back of Saigan. Right midfielder of Matt Phillips. The centre midfield pairing of Darren Gibson and Eric Djemba-Djemba. Gabriel Overton over on the left. And with the two strikers, Maran Shamak and Jose Altidore. And they are assisted on the touchline by David Moyes. Now, if that team is not enough to give you nightmares, then I don't know what is.
Right, we will move on then to our Send Him to the Reserves feature, which is slightly different this week. The listeners at home have sent in their nominations, so we'll listen to those now and then have a discussion after.
Hello, my name is Stu and I am a Rangers supporter. There was a number of players I could have nominated to be sent to the reserves this week. However, decided to go for a man who shares a name with one of your co-hosts, actually. And that man is Michael Stewart, as I believe he was one of the poorer players to ever grace the Scottish game. He made his professional debut for Manchester United in the year 2000. It was probably as good as it ever got from during his career. He had the chance to go on loan to the team Royal Antwerp in Belgium, but he didn't because he wanted to fight for his first team place at United. That really didn't work out for him, and he ended up going on a failed loan spell to Notts Forest in the 03-04 season. Following season he was signed by Hearts on loan, where he was later described by Craig Levine as being the worst value for money signing he had ever made, despite only costing £1 per week. After that he was dubbed not good enough, and he went on to sign for Hibs for a couple of seasons, where he made a total of 54 appearances. This was a strange move for him, as Hearts were described by himself as his boyhood club. After being dubbed again not good enough by Hibs, he moved back to Hearts, where he stayed for 3 seasons, becoming the first player since the Second World War to move to Hearts, then to Hibs, and then back to Hearts. After once again being described as not good enough, which is a bit of a recurring theme during his career, he moved to Turkey for, forgive me for my pronunciation here, Glencare Birligi, where he made a grand total of 0 appearances as he managed to get injured and was released from his contract. He went on then to sign for his final club, who were Charlton Athletic, in the year 2011, he played a total of 9 games for them, then retired. A pro career lasting a total of 11 years, making around about 180 league appearances, I believe, which for a professional, especially professional, playing the majority of his time in Scotland, is a very poor return, especially for that length of time. After his football career, he tried and once again failed to become an SNP MP. After that, he went on to punditry, which he can only be described as just as poor at as he is with a ball at his feet. From this, he was actually sacked a few months ago, in February I believe it was, for a rant made on social media towards Rangers media officer Jim Traynor. So that was really a football career and then career thereafter of failure and nothing less, nothing more either. Really a dreadful player, and can only really be described as a shite footballer. I don't understand how he ever made it as a pro, and I believe he should be sent to the reserves this week. Cheers, boys.
The player that I'm sending to the reserves this week is Kyle Walker. Whilst people have been taking this COVID pandemic very seriously, he has taken it upon himself to throw some kind of bizarre sex party whilst his manager lost his mother because of the virus. It's just a shocking use of time. It's bad enough for anyone, but as such a public figure, he should be absolutely embarrassed by himself. You contrast him to someone like Marcus Rashford, who's been using his platform for such good fighting social justice and helping all those school kids get their meals. And yeah, Kyle Walker is just an absolute embarrassment for all he's done. Pathetic person.
The person I'd pick for the reserves would be Blair Henderson of Edinburgh City. The guy's a goal machine everywhere he goes, except one club he's been at, which just happens to be my local club, Stirling Albion. I have a couple of Albion supporting pals who always complained about his uselessness in front of goal, and they were in celebration mode when he left. However, he went on to be a prolific goal scorer at Annan, and his efforts certainly did not go unnoticed by Edinburgh City. My pals can only assume he had a personal vendetta against Stirling, as the club were frequently at the bottom of the SPFL, and they were only saved from going down thanks to a good run of form, following a good transfer window in January 2017. So I'd send Edinburgh City's Blair Henderson to the reserves. Let's be honest, that's where he deserved to be at Stirling anyway.
Hi guys, Andrew's made me do something I'm not particularly very comfortable with, but I'm going to try it, just for his sake more than mine. But firstly, I want to say how sorry I am about losing Scott. He was genuinely a real character, and I'm really sad I've only met him once. But I think you've done a massive service carrying on this in his spirit. My nomination is nothing short of controversial, but I am going to nominate Alan Shearer. This is mainly because people think he should be near the top, arguably one of the best players, and I'm so glad that you guys came to your wisdom and didn't even put him up front. Why? Because he's scored the most goals in the Premiership? You know more than anyone that everything has to be put in perspective. Shearer is the most arrogant individual anyone can hope to meet. If he cared anything about being the best footballer, he would not have retired from England in his prime, arguably at 30. He valued being a big fish in a little pond, rather than being the best he could be. He should have signed for a team that would have been better in his career, such as Man United when they came calling, or the other team that wanted him at the time, Internazionale, that wanted to replace Ronaldo, the real Ronaldo. He had to take every penalty and every free kick, even though there was a far better suited player, Laurent Robert, and at the time was arguably better captains on the team, such as Shea Given. If Shearer had been signed by a more appropriate team, such as Man United, then his contribution would have been limited accordingly, and he probably would have only got to about 4th or 5th on the Premier League's all-time scorers. For me, though, as well, you have to look at the bigger context. He's been the worst, most expensive transfer in the world. Because afterwards, he's only ever won an Intertoto Cup. And I know this is going to sound very controversial, but I hope it opens up some debate. And in all fairness, you've got to ignore the Sunderland and Newcastle fans about this. So especially for you Scots up there and Northern Irish, it would be a fantastic talking point to see what you actually think, impartially, his contributions were.
Even from a Sunderland fan, it's quite a bold claim to put Alan Shearer in the reserves. I'll have to agree with George to say that Shearer is quite arrogant, as for many reasons I cannot stand him, but it's kind of bred into you being a Sunderland fan.
I have to disagree. He can't feature in the reserves because his record speaks for itself, and I just can't bring myself to vote in that way.
Yeah, it was a compelling enough case, but I'm afraid I can't send the record goal scorer in the Premier League to the reserves.
Yeah, so moving on to Stuart Sloan's nomination of Michael Stewart, I think it's a little bit harsh in a way. Although he didn't win any silverware in his career, Michael Stewart, he got 8 appearances for Man United, and I think that sort of speaks for itself. And he was a decent performer in a Hearts and Hibs jersey, and I suppose the supporters of each of those clubs may not hold him too fondly by switching allegiances, but I think also that he's a pretty good and pretty fair pundit. I know that Stuart's a Rangers fan, and that side of the city of Glasgow, they sort of take a dislike to Michael Stewart because in recent months, he's taken a sort of stance and speaking up against Rangers, but I think it's been quite warranted in what he's been saying, so he won't be getting my vote this week for the reserves.
Yeah, I think for me, Blair Henderson was a player that's kind of been a League Two goal scoring machine. So for those who don't follow the league that closely, we've been to quite a few Stirling Albion games in Edinburgh City. We've seen him play, and we actually went all the way up to Elgin and seen Stirling Albion win 3-2 in one of the more exciting games and best away days I've ever been on. And Blair Henderson scored the equaliser at 2-2 and came and did a knee slide towards the three of us and one of our other friend, Tom, who was with us. So I've only got fond memories of Blair Henderson.
So I think this week I'm going to have to side with Jack and his nomination for Kyle Walker. I mean, we know that the last few months have been pretty difficult and we've all been sort of trapped indoors for a lot of the time. But I think Kyle Walker has to be sent to the reserves, as breaking lockdown rules to have sex parties it doesn't really bode well for you. And especially when your manager's lost his mum, it gives a bit more of a personal touch. So I think Kyle Walker gets my vote, and I'll be sending him to the reserves. And I hope I can convince you two boys.
Yeah, I didn't like him anyway, and I like him even less now.
Yeah, I think he gets my vote as well, as he just can't be doing that. Even when we're not in lockdown, that's still a bit weird.
Exactly.
Well, yeah, that has it decided then. Kyle Walker joins an illustrious list of players on the reserves, and thank you to all our listeners who sent in their nominations this week. That leaves us with one more thing to do this week on the show, and that is the Lockdown Accumulator, which is getting a lot more interesting. Premier League is back. The English Championship is back. We'll have our selections from the Bundesliga and La Liga. Who have you gone for this week?
Well, bastards Besiktas last week let me down, and they were odds on to win. So it must be my week this week. In the Premier League, I've got Wolves to beat West Ham at 23-20. In the Championship, I have Bristol City to beat Blackburn at 23-10. La Liga, I have Atletico Bilbao to beat Real Betis at home at evens. And in the Bundesliga, I've got Dortmund to beat RB Leipzig away at 9-5. £5 gets you a delightful £198 at 66.
I'm enjoying this segment a bit more these days because I'm looking at the teams and I feel I can make a bit of a better judgment of sort of England, Spain and Germany rather than Belarus and Taiwan. But I've gone for Leicester to beat Watford in the Premier League. I've gone for Swansea to beat Middlesbrough in the Championship. Going over to Spain, I've got Athletic Bilbao to beat Real Betis, and I've gone for Bayer Leverkusen to beat Hertha Berlin. And it's not quite as juicy as Andrew's, but my £5 gets you £106.58 back.
Very, very nice. This week I have gone for, in the Premier League, Bournemouth. They are at home to Crystal Palace at 6-4. Levante to beat Espanyol at 29-10. Also gone for Dortmund away to Red Bull Leipzig at 9-5. And I'm backing Stoke away to Reading at 6-4. And the fiver returns a whopping 341.25.
Whoosh.
Well, that's what you want in your sandwiches. So that just about wraps up things this week on the Backs to the Wall podcast. As always, thanks for listening, and remember, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts and YouTube. Remember to like and subscribe, and do get in touch with us on our Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. We'll be back next week with another podcast. Do keep an eye out, because we'll be having a very special guest joining us in the near future. So thanks for listening, and from everyone here at the Backs to the Wall podcast, we'll see you soon.
Taken by Emery. Yes! Titus Bramble! An unlikely goal scorer, but Newcastle don't mind. He couldn't have tucked it away with any more confidence. Driven right foot into the roof of the net for the goal that may take Newcastle